There's
Oh my.
83 rows.
83 rows. So 83 different queries.
Yeah. So you can have one or more query per visual in DirectQuery.
Wow. Wow.
So, yo! What's up?
Yo!
I'm Adam, and I'm here with Bob Ward, who is a master at SQL Server and a legend. And we've got a couple tips for you about using DirectQuery with Power BI from a SQL perspective. Stay tuned. If you're finding us for the first time, be sure to hit that subscribe button to stay up to date with all the videos from both Patrick and myself. And I am joined today with Mr. Bob Ward. Bob, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Adam.
Awesome.
Good to hear from you.
Awesome. Hopefully you're hanging in there with the situations in our world today.
Absolutely.
If you're watching this video in the future, we're locked down in the whole coronavirus stuff. So this will be great looking at this like 2 to 3 years from now. Just a little history. I've known Bob Ward since I think 2007 or 2008 when I was back in the support world. Bob was one of the technical leaders from a SQL support perspective at the time, and he was my mentor kind of going through SQL support and taught me a lot of things. And he is just his knowledge and wealth of experience on SQL Server is amazing. So Bob, I don't know if you want to kind of, where are you today in the world of SQL?
Well, first of all, Adam, thanks for having me on today. Quick funny story for your listeners about me meeting Adam, because when I first met him, I did not know what I was in for, because all I know is that some goof geek had a big Star Wars Lego thing on top of his desk. And I remember telling my colleagues, like, who is this guy with a Star Wars Lego set? And turns out Adam is not just an incredible talent for Power BI and for technology, but has been a close friend of mine for many years. I'm in the SQL engineering team now. As Adam said, we both met in the support organization, but I work in SQL engineering. I do work out of Texas. So even before coronavirus hit, I was working from home and working out of Texas. And I'm an architect in the SQL team. I spent a lot of time, translating the message of what we're doing in the SQL Server space, whether it's SQL Server 2019, Linux containers, even now spending some time working in the Azure SQL space. And then as an architect, giving great feedback to our team about what our customers are seeing and how we can improve our products going forward. So it's a really fun role to be into. This is 26 and a half years now, Adam, for me to be in Microsoft, all in SQL Server. And quite frankly, I'm still very passionate and love what I do.
Love it. Love it. Yeah, I know. And when we were working together back in Las Colinas, Texas, I just soaked up a wealth of knowledge about SQL hanging around you guys. And so it's been really fun knowing you and hanging out with you and just living life with you. So
yeah, now we see each other. Well, when we were traveling,
when
right?
we travel,
we were running each other somewhere in the middle of Europe or something and seeing each other for months, So, but now it's fun to be here remote, on your show.
Yeah, it was rare for us to see each other when we were in the U.S. We'd have to go overseas to see each other. So,
exactly.
Yep, amazing. All right, so Bob, we're going to go through some things from a Power BI perspective, and I wanted to get your take with your SQL knowledge in terms of just what are your thoughts around these given areas to help people when they're trying to work with data in Power BI to help SQL out a little bit. I want to get your initial reaction to this. So I'm going to show, you should be seeing, I've got a report up there. It's a DirectQuery report. This is a beautiful report. Patrick and I worked very hard at this report. It looks amazing. This is what every executive would want to look at. And it keeps going, and there's lots of information here, whatnot. So
sure,
from a DirectQuery perspective, what would you expect to see if I were to run a SQL profiler trace? How many queries do you think are sitting there?
I can only imagine. I think to produce all the aggregations and the details and the sub-aggregations, I wouldn't be surprised if there's at least just the top of the screen, half a dozen queries at least running this.
All right. So I ran a trace and here's the, there's 83 rows.
83 rows. So 83 different queries.
Yeah. So you can have one or more query per visual in DirectQuery.
Wow.
So just depending on, DAX.
I mean, one thing already, Adam, that I would say as a reaction as a SQL Server person is that's way too chatty. And what I mean by that is that, we'll always encourage developers and people using SQL, the SQL language, to group, queries in a stored procedure or something. So you're just sending one request to the server from your client, and then you can bring multiple result sets back. That's fine. But sending a single query is almost like fetching a row at a time or something crazy like that, right? So that's already inefficient, in my opinion, doing that.
Yep. So that's kind of the basis of what we're going to talk about.
Okay, great.
Like that, that's the insight that I want, is like coming from a SQL side of it, like your advice on some of those things. So the first,
on your own laptop, it doesn't matter, right? So if you're just running that as a Power BI, desktop app, and SQL's running on your laptop, and you were to run that, who cares, right?
Yep.
But once you start putting that across a network somehow, especially in the cloud, that becomes just incredibly inefficient.
Sure. So the first thought I had was, if we're going with DirectQuery, so DirectQuery, for those that don't know, is when we are not importing that data into Power BI, we're leaving the data in the data source. So this could be SQL Server, it could be another relational source like Oracle or some other database. But in this case, we'll use SQL, whether that's in Azure or on-prem or whatever. And so when doing that, typically some of my initial thoughts is we don't want to run this against an operational database. Like just something that's actually in production and running, because of like when I showed you earlier, you said it was chatty. And so what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, and there's no question, there's great benefit, even without DirectQuery, right, to customers taking read-only workloads and running those perhaps against a warehouse, or in the case of operational system, a lot of people choose to use a replica. So for example, imagine you had an operational data store with SQL Server where you have high transaction volumes coming in, and you set up an always-on available secondary replica for read purposes. So that would be an example of something that feels like an operational store, where you don't have to put it into a warehouse format, that a DirectQuery would be perfect for. In fact, that's exactly one of the reasons why people use secondary read replicas for that purpose. It could be replication. SQL Server replication could have that set up to a subscriber. So offloading large read workloads, especially ones that might be fairly unpredictable, I have a feeling in DirectQuery that might be the case. It's probably your best angle for operational stores. So that's just some thoughts top of my head I would think of.
Yeah, and that's easy enough to do from a Azure SQL database or even on-prem perspective. I mean, those are capabilities that exist.
That's what's so cool about Azure SQL as a brand, is all that read replica type functionality that's available no matter what you slice and dice, whether you use SQL Server, Linux containers, Azure SQL Database managed instance, you have that replica type availability no matter which deployment option you pick. And
so in that case, it would just be like you have like a read-only connection string versus the primary connection string at that point?
Right. Yeah. As a developer, or even say like with DirectQuery, you would be able to go in your connection string and say, look, my intent is to do read-only. And then SQL would automatically direct you to wherever that read replica was. So you wouldn't have to know the actual physical host where the replica exists.
Nice. And then for folks watching this, one of the features that we have inside of Power BI, because we don't have direct exposure to the connection string. And so the connection string option for application intent is not readily available for you to do. When you go to SQL Server, under advanced, there's a checkbox there. It says use failover connection or something of that nature. And that will add the application intent read-only to the connection string. So, so be aware of that. Be aware of that. It's not for someone that's maybe SQL savvy and not Power BI savvy, it's not that obvious. So
it's good that option exists though.
Yes, it does. So, and it was funny. One of the things I did early on was to prove, because someone was challenging me that, no, that's not what it does. And one of the things that Bob got me into when I was in support, and it's one of the things I really, really miss from my support days, is I went and got a memory dump. And I went and looked and said, this is the connection string that's in memory at the time that we're doing it. There's application intent. So bam, there it is. One of the things I've had from a discussion point with customers and whatnot is when they think about DirectQuery and we talk about performance optimizations, and even some of the databases I go into and look at, even though these are large enterprise organizations, people have varying skills at SQL or even Power BI. When we start looking not only at the Power BI data model, but also when we start looking at SQL itself, there are comments that I hear from other folks saying, oh man, this is just database 101. Like you should be doing this. What would you consider as database 101 that you should be doing from a general performance perspective?
Well, one thing that I think we were just talking about kind of early on was the fact be efficient in submitting your SQL queries to the engine. Use things like stored procedures. So if you've got a bunch of different queries to submit for a direct query that might populate a Power BI dashboard, trying to set up a single specific queries for everything is not going to make a lot of sense. Doing this on your laptop's no big deal. When you have to transmit this across some sort of network latency sensitive scenario, like say the cloud, you're going to want to try to consolidate your queries as much as possible. Even simple things like you taking advantage of the fact that SQL is a relational language and using aggregations, group by, sums, maxes, those kind of type things is something I've seen even miss from a database 101 perspective. So just taking efficient use of the SQL Server language and avoiding these chatty type behaviors where you're going after one row at a time, for example, things of that nature, right? That's one thing. The second thing is just pure index and statistics. I mean, this is no different than looking up. I mean, gosh, nobody does this anymore with an encyclopedia or a catalog, right? Look at Adam, he does. It's the same concept, right? You've got a huge table you're going after. If you can't index it, it's going to require SQL Server, of course, to scan this massive amounts of data. Certainly one of those number one performance problems we see, even just for SQL apps, is people just not going through the process of putting any indexes on a table or using statistics that the query optimizer can take advantage of. There's all sorts of tools to help you there, though. Even in Azure SQL Database, we do automatic indexing in those scenarios where we think an index can be possible. And then I think about maybe something like that makes sense for reporting, and that would be range queries. So indexes are great. Some indexes are only good for like single row fetching. Like I want to go to a specific ID key value I have or something. But what about scenarios, especially in warehouse queries, where you have to go up huge ranges of data, like date time ranges? This is where Columnstore indexes become just extremely invaluable. Columnstore indexes don't require any application changes. Like in the case of direct query, Adam, you wouldn't be changing your queries or reports. This is something you put on the back end. And it's perfect for those warehouse scenarios, especially for large scans of range data. Probably one of the most underused features I've seen of SQL Server's Columnstore indexes.
And I think folks from a Power BI perspective are going to be, if you're familiar with Power BI and the way that its engine handles data, you're going to be familiar with some of the I would say the high level concepts of Columnstore, because the Vertipack engine inside of Power BI or analysis services uses that same type of technology.
We both use the Vertipack engine actually to use this within the SQL engine, and that's where we kind of got the engine in the first place.
So back on the database 101, in terms of the chattiness, and you said limit the queries. One of the things, at least for Power BI folks to be aware of, is that each visual from a direct query perspective submits one or more queries, and you don't necessarily have control over those queries. So that query, the visual, the way this works is the Power BI visual will issue a DAX statement to the underlying AS engine. And then that AS engine translates that to T-SQL and says, go get me the data, because the data doesn't reside in analysis services. So it's got to go get that data for that specific visual. And so in your case of, you want to think about how many visuals you have on that report and limit, the more you have, the more chatty it's going to be. So your way of limiting the chattiness is reduce the number of visuals on there. There are some things you can do in terms of submitting your own T-SQL. So if you have a more structured T-SQL that's maybe more efficient than the auto-generated T-SQL from the AS perspective, we all know auto-generated T-SQL is the best T-SQL. But in case you may have your own, then that's something you can supply as well. So be aware of that. Another thing I'd maybe throw in on just understanding the data warehousing and AS side of things is maybe avoid some of those wide tables. So maybe smaller tables in terms of what we're fetching. From the SQL side, I don't know how that plays into how it goes and gets the data in terms of efficiency. I know on the AS side, having some of those not so wide tables can help in terms of compression and things of that nature from the Columnstore side of it.
It's a factor for SQL Server as well. One of the things about Columnstore that's nice, though, is that we only go after the columns you specify. So even if you have really, really wide tables for Columnstore index-based tables, we don't have to go over the entire set. Right. A huge wide SQL table will affect how large the table is, which larger table is going to affect how efficient we can go in and get certain rows in there. So yeah, all those kind of type discussions you just said about the width of a table can apply to SQL Server as well.
Yep.
One other comment about the nature of the visualizations you mentioned is, my guess is these queries probably come in as ad hoc queries into SQL Server.
Yes.
And one kind of faux pas for a SQL Server setup is a large number of ad hoc queries that don't get what's called parameterized. So if you don't have control over that through, say, DirectQuery to parameterize these queries, then there are options in SQL to help SQL Server do that. That'll reduce the time it takes to compile these things. It's called forced parameterization.
Nice.
That could actually make things a little more efficient if a large number of these things are ad hoc coming into the engine.
The other thing I'll throw in there just as a warning, and back me up if I'm off base here, but if you happen to be going against your production transactional server and not like a read replica or some reporting database, doing that type of option, would that add additional overhead and potentially interfere with the production load?
Well, I would never recommend anybody just turn that on blindly. So, that kind of option doesn't even have, you as a DirectQuery user wouldn't even have authority to do that.
Yeah.
You'd have to be working with an administrator over a database or a SQL Server to turn an option like that on. And yes, I would not do that unless you knew you had a really heavy ad hoc workload, it's well tested, and perhaps it may not make sense to go against an operational store if that's what you have to do.
Right. Yep. Cool. All right. So going on, so Columnstore is an awesome feature.
Yes.
And I know you're very passionate about that. Another thing that we do from a direct query side of things, and we've had this from certain customer engagements that I've worked on, is if we are hitting those base tables or maybe we're hitting a view, but that view's got a bunch of joins on there because their database is an operational database. It's not in a star schema. And so we got to have all these joins. So one of the tips that we usually give to people in those situations is possibly like materializing that view and reducing the call. So that'll just make that call go faster. I don't know.
Sure. You mean like index views or something like that?
Either index view or actually like generating a table off of the view data.
I see. Like creating your own table. So we have this concept called an index view, which is very much like what you're talking about, where you don't have to create a separate table. But I've seen people do what you're talking about, where they almost like create a denormalized version of the results, almost like a cached version of their results.
Right.
And then they refresh that. No question.
Yep.
Yeah, if you find yourself joining so many different tables because the database design is so normalized, there's that great balance between using some sort of denormalized version of the table, which could be, like you said, materialized view, versus having to join so many tables together. I found so many people struggle in those heavily normalized cases of trying to debug a problem with a huge set of joins against so many different tables. Do you have the right indexes? Right. Is the right join strategy being used? Those kind of type of things. I see that all the time.
Yep. And so I also know one of the key things I saw coming with Azure Synapse Analytics, I don't know how much you're involved with that, is that feature of those materialized views. And
yeah, that's kind of baked into Synapse, right, as part of the whole thing.
Yep. So
one thing I should mention about SQL Server that's agnostic to you building the queries is improvements in the engine. So in SQL Server 2019, which is also in Azure, we added this capability in the query processor called intelligent query processing. This could really benefit your DirectQuery user. The idea being is that you go to the latest compatibility of SQL Server, and we just add in all this functionality in the query processor that's based on problems you and I saw in support, whether it's memory grant problems because of hashes and sorts and so forth, or even turning on something called batch mode for row store, which almost acts like a little column store index type query as part of the query. So, one thing to keep in mind, if you're using DirectQuery and like what SQL Server version should I pick, it could be that you should go to something like 19 or Azure Database where you can take advantage of some of that functionality.
And then all they need to do is just make sure they're on that latest compatibility mode, or are there other switches or feature things that they have to
That's it. Yeah, it's interesting. It's really not a feature. It's more just an enhancement to the query processor built into the engine. You just turn on the compat level to light up, you want to do that. And there's even functionality in SQL Server like Query Store for you to compare what was your query performance for queries coming in from DirectQuery before and after that change. So if you're worried about, hey, I'm on the latest compat level for risk aversion, and I don't want to remove the latest compat, or I'm worried about performance, you could actually use Query Store to compare like what was your performance before and after.
Nice. The last thing I was going to mention, and then I'll throw it back to you, Bob, just for completeness, I do want to show for the folks watching this video, just some of the things you can do in Power BI to help with that chattiness. So let me go ahead and switch over to my computer real quick. If you're inside of Power BI desktop, if you go to File and then come down to Options and Settings and then Options, there are some settings down here. If we come under Current File, you'll see this Query Reduction option. And then you'll see a couple of items here. So one is to reduce the number of queries by disabling cross-highlighting and filtering, which is on by default for all visuals. So the idea there is if I select a slice of a pie chart, it's going to automatically tell all the other visuals to go get updated data based on that filter. It would be off by default if you check this box, and then you can independently say to turn on which visuals you want to cross-highlight. The other two options here for slicers and filters, by default, the way slicers work is if I make a selection on the slicer, it's going to, again, signal all of those visuals to go update. So instead, this puts an apply button so you can make your changes and then hit apply and say, now go and do that. So if you have like multiple select items or something of that nature, this will allow you to control some of that chattiness back and forth and just make it a better experience from a consumer point of view. And then the other thing to think about, and this goes along with some of the materializing views, some of the things we talked about on the SQL side, Patrick's got a whole series out there on the aggregations feature inside of Power BI. And so this is that mix of having both a higher grain summary table that's in the AS model. And then when you want to go down to those detail levels, then the engine automatically knows to kick over to DirectQuery to go get those detail rows. So that avoids you from having to go to SQL for, hopefully like 80 to 90% of your slicing and dicing. But when you do need to go down to those detail levels, that's when we go hit SQL, and we know that we're going to hit a higher lag on that than we would if we hit the aggregation table in memory.
Nice.
So, and I'll have a link up above for that playlist that you can go check out if you're interested in aggregations. By the way, aggregations is not a premium feature, so you can take advantage of it today. All right. So, Bob, any other thoughts that you have in terms of SQL usage and coming from a reporting standpoint? Any words of wisdom?
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind, because I think about Power BI, I'm just a user. I'm not Adam Saxton or Patrick, right? I mean, I just use Power BI, which I love. I love the technology. And I think about all the different data sources that Power BI allows you to go after, not just SQL Server, right? So if you want to kind of manage that more in the SQL Server level, there's a new functionality that we've expanded from SQL 16, now in SQL 19, called Polybase. And the idea being is that you would create external tables in SQL Server that look like SQL tables. But in what we're doing is we're redirecting queries from those tables to other data sources. And we have built-in provider functionality for Oracle, Teradata, MongoDB, other SQL servers, Azure SQL Database. And what's really cool is bring your own ODBC driver. So if I think about all the different data sources I can use in Power BI, you can set up SQL Server to be a hub to go after all sorts of data sources like that. But what you're doing is you're controlling access to those data sources through SQL, through this external table concept where you set up the security rules. Think of it like a view where the data doesn't exist in SQL, exists somewhere else. But you can even join across these just like SQL tables, use data classifications. So if I thought about an average Power BI or even expert Power BI user today, looking at SQL Server Polybase and SQL 19 could be something that could be advantageous to the average user.
That's amazing. I know that we do run in with some customers where they want, they have DirectQuery and or they're trying to do import and mixing those data sources. And sometimes some of the data sources they may be using may not be fully workable from a Power BI perspective, but check and see if they're available from a Polybase perspective. And maybe that's a valid option for you. And
to make it even crazy, Adam, we even have Hadoop access.
Oh.
So if you want to go after Hadoop data that's not structured like SQL, you can do it. And if you really want to get crazy, you can deploy something called a big data cluster where we'll deploy Hadoop for you. So yeah, we're kind of getting radical these days, man.
I got to wonder, so just a warning for everyone out there, with all things test and, because your performance may vary when doing something like that. So just be aware, your performance already is going to have an overhead from a DirectQuery perspective. I can only imagine if we throw Hadoop behind SQL as part of that it would be blazing fast.
But I will tell you that we put some scalability into it. So you do need to test inside of that, but we put a lot of built-in scale to the solution. So
that's good.
We're not scanning petabytes of files. We know how to filter and go after things in a very performant way.
Awesome. All right. So that may be a very well option for you to go use. So that's
Sure.
exciting to hear about. And I'll have links down in the description below that you can check out for all the things that we've talked about so that you can go read up more on those items. All right, we want to pass this off to you. What are your thoughts about what we mentioned? Did you find something new about SQL that you didn't know about? Or do you have other tips and tricks that you want to share about using DirectQuery? Go ahead and leave that down in the comments below and keep the conversation going. If you like this video, be sure to hit that big thumbs up button, smash it if you so desire. If you're new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button to stay up to date with all the videos from both Patrick and myself. And from both Patrick, myself, and Bob, thank you so much for watching. Keep being awesome, and we'll see you in the next video.